Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the oil and gas industry's role in the energy future. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. As you listeners know, we are at a pivotal time. I believe that forces are conspiring to lay bare the myth of a simple and easy energy transition. And that brings us to what I'm calling the moment. I have a solo episode for you today, which is always really fun because I kind of know what I want to talk about, but not exactly, because I use these solo pods to work out some ideas and also to solicit your feedback on the ideas. So thanks so much for your really warm engagement on the solo pods and on the ideas for my upcoming book, The Myth and the Moment. If you'd like more of what I have to say on these topics, I hope you will go to energythinks.com or Substack and subscribe to my weekly newsletter called Both of These Things Are True. Now, I will kick off today's solo episode of the Energy Thinks podcast. Okay, this is going to be really fun. The quality of my solo pods has a number of factors. One, what kind of exercise did I get in the morning? Two, how much coffee did I drink and how long ago was it? So I want you to know that this morning I do a master swim class, and we had this just terrific guest coach this morning, and we did a VO2 max workout, which I didn't know what that was, which I will tell you was probably for the best because it involves a lot of swimming as hard as you can for like 4 minutes and 2 minutes over and over and over for an hour. And I am exhilarated now, and I'm going to really need a nap later. And then I came home and felt like I deserved a second cup of coffee. So I had that. So you're getting me on that like post really hard workout plus caffeine high. So this might not be the podcast to listen to on 1.5 speed, just so you know. What I wanted to focus on today is the center left, our climate-centric stakeholders, but in particular, this rise of the center left. So in earlier writings, I called this the inevitable rise of practical environmentalism. In the last podcast with Ruy Teixeira, you heard us talk about the abundance movement and the book. And I thought what I'd do is give you a little bit of a primer on like, what is this? Well, what is happening in the center left space? What do I think is missing? And what happens if they aren't successful? And what can you do about it? I think the biggest thing that is dawning on me as I'm finishing up the full draft of the book, The Myth and the Moment, the full thing that I'm coming to understand is we, the oil and gas industry, are going to play a really important part in what comes after the myth. And I had been thinking, the myth, like the myth, it's unraveling. The moment, it has arrived. But here's the really interesting thing. The myth is far from dead, right? And even if it were, I think it might have zombie-like properties. So here, let me talk a little bit about that. So I digress already. I've been thinking about the left, the Democrats. They're in this moment. They're trying to figure out who they are. What do we stand for? What do we do? How do we recapture not just public attention, but actually public popularity, public interest? And what's interesting about some of those things is there's like how do we get their attention? But what I think maybe are the more interesting conversations is what does the public want and how do we meet that set of interests? Like, how do we provide what the market wants to buy, basically, in terms of politics? Now, this is fracturing into two pretty obvious camps, right? My shorthand is the resistance, like the doubling down on the progressive left. I think this is really characterized by the Bernie Sanders AOC fighting oligarchy tour. And this is important because they are going to red states, but, maybe bluish towns in red states. They were in Missoula, Montana last week, but they're getting huge crowds. So this is something for us to pay attention to, because if you're in the resistance, the myth of an easy energy transition is not only alive and well, it's like part of the programming forever. When I think about the unraveling of the myth of an easy energy transition, I don't think that raveling includes the progressive left. I think that the progressive left will forever be wed to the myth. And this is still a half-baked idea. So again, give it some thought and let me know what you think. But if that's true, then there's a lot of shared interest in making sure that there is an alternative to that on the left, right? If you consider that we're living in the US in a time when the conservatives or the right are dominant, and that at some point there will be a relevant political wind shift to the left, then where those winds go matters to you. Do they go to the far, far progressive left, or do they go somewhere new? So let's talk about the somewhere new. I am really interested in this idea of pragmatic climate action, environmental pragmatism. Ruy and I talked a lot about this. I mean, I think this is something the public wants, right? They don't want all or nothing climate. They want like something reasonable that makes sense to them. And so abundance is one of the ideas filling this space. And there have been a number of organizations and people building this idea of a new kind of center left for a long time. The fact that it's reaching a lot more people and getting some traction, I think, is a factor of momentum, a factor of providing something that the public is interested in, that people like me are interested in, but also a reaction to the Trump administration, because there's a little more room to take on the progressive left if you're in the center left. So this is an important thing for us to understand and to think about a little bit. So let me just do a little primering here on the abundance movement. So this idea of abundance, it congealed some different ideas. One was YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard, which has arisen largely in like California out of this idea that any small group can stop almost anything. And that if you want to have, for example, affordable housing, you have to have a different movement that's for saying yes. And then maybe a year-ish ago, maybe 2 years ago, Thompson wrote an article in The Atlantic entitled Abundance and really made for the first time a coherent case for it. And then he and Ezra Klein of the New York Times opinion column and podcast co-wrote this book, Abundance, that Ruy and I talked about in the last podcast, and which is getting a fair amount of attention out in the world. So the last fall, there was the first Abundance Conference, which was a mix of center-left and center-right organizations trying to come together to think about what this could mean. And this September, there will be a second Abundance Conference. So it's getting some traction and some interest. So let's talk a little bit about what I like about it, why I think it's getting so much attention, and how I think it could improve. So what I like about this abundance book, which I actually really highly recommend that you read, and if you're not a reader, they've done a lot of interviews on the book, and so you can check out some of those. But the thing I like about it, first and foremost, is it just straight on takes on the progressive left and the ways in which the Democrats writ large have kind of ground government's gears to a halt. This is a party that is pro-government and has also pretty consistently done things that make government not work. So it takes a huge amount of courage to take on your in-group. And I have a lot of respect for that. In fact, it's easy for the left to critique the right and the right to critique the left, and we can talk about that more. But if you're willing to speak to your own group, progressives, which this book explicitly does, and say, hey, there's some really important things we've gotten wrong and we should do them differently. That takes a tremendous amount of courage, and it's fresh and it's interesting. And I think what they're selling is something that people want to buy, which is a more effective world. Now, the downside of this more effective world where you can, for example, build things, advanced tech, have abundance of supply, The downside of this is that somebody's not going to get what they want, right? This is a explicit rejection of the idea that, one, everybody in the coalition gets something they want, which has been I think for the last few years, a real consistent element of democratic politics is everybody gets something. But the second thing is this idea of communities not getting to veto a project. That means if you carry this to its logical conclusion, at some point, there is a decision maker, probably in government, that weighs the pros and cons and says, yeah, those 3 homeowners are going to lose. We're building the transmission line. We're siting the small modular nuclear reactor here. There will, by definition, be people who perceive themselves as winners and people who perceive themselves as losers. And that's really important. And they take that on explicitly, which has to be at the heart of any permitting reform, for example. There's like the government bureaucracy, but the other thing is everyone doesn't get what they want in the end is a really key component. And for example, in permitting reform, you would take that one step further. Everyone who doesn't get what they want doesn't get to sue and stop the project anyway, right? So this is important. This is sort of setting up a liberal case for less bureaucracy and trade-offs. Ultimately, you have to weigh trade-offs, and not everyone's going to be a winner and not everyone's going to be a loser if you want to proceed. Okay. So why do I think it's getting attention? One, I think Democrats and good lefties are casting about, trying to find some path forward, some coherent set of things we believe in. The things I use we as like if I'm the left, the things we believe in were rejected largely. Big government, this coalition decision making, this everybody gets a veto. And, I would throw in there like climate over all things, identity politics over all things. Like these things were rejected. So what would be a different philosophy that could be put forward? Abundance is a really interesting framing. It's casting a vision, which I've always felt is key to capturing the imagination of people you would like to do things differently. You have to cast a vision. You have to be willing to have some principles around it. And this is a framework. I think it's creating a lot of interesting conversations. And it takes on this idea that I think is really important, that if essentially status quo progressive left politics ultimately dominate the left, we as a society are never going to see the meaningful dissolution of the myth of a simple and quick energy transition. Why? Because you can imagine a reactionary presidential election in 4 years. And if the winner of that is a Democrat, I've heard a number of people joke about the AOC presidency, a progressive left Democrat. They have absolutely no incentive to let go of the idea of the myth of an easy energy transition because it serves their interests, right? It's easy, it's simple, there's villains, and it's just those other people that's keeping us from getting there. We're just right back into that. So I like the idea that within the left, there is a coherent framework and ideology to talk and think about an alternative to that. An alternative that is about abundance, that is about smaller, more efficient government, that's about fundamentally trade-offs, decisiveness, getting things done, action. Now, there's a number of things I think could be improved upon it. And I'm cautious in my critique because, again, I want to emphasize just the general taking on of the orthodoxy of the left just takes a kind of courage that I admire. And so that is like top of the list. But the second thing is like, how do I think it could be better if I now, as a center lefty, could critique a center lefty proposal? Here's a few things that I think are needed and that I hope to have the opportunity to advocate for in my broader engagement circles. The one is, I think for a center lefty movement, an abundance movement to be successful, it's going to actually have to scramble coalitions, which means it needs to be truly bipartisan. It needs to make a space for moderate conservatives to participate. And the way at least the book is written and the conversations are underway, they're aimed at trying to win over the left, right? So it's not their purpose to win over people on the center right. But maybe what I mean instead of what could improve is maybe what I really want to say is what could come after the abundance movement? What's the next thing that could come? What could be the thing that follows it that gets real traction? Well, I think that will have to be truly more bipartisan, which means it will have to coalition. It will have to include coalition of uncomfortable partners. Like, what could that mean? That could mean conservatives who are interested in liberal democracy, for example, like small liberal democracy. Like, it could be people like not just labor. You hear on the left, like, we need a coalition with labor. It's like, that's code for something that's not what they really need. What they really need is working class voters, right? If you're going to have an abundance agenda that's going to allow for mining and building and transmission lines, and you need actual, maybe union, maybe not union, labor, working class voters. And that, I think, is super uncomfortable because now we're getting out of this like, oh, we're all in, and then we have the same values and we're just repackaging it. No, like, we actually want to build stuff with other people who want to build stuff. And there might be a whole bunch of things we don't agree on. I think that's going to be really important. So, for example, right now, I've been thinking a lot about carbon capture sequestration, hydrogen, even pipelines, right? Geothermal. Right now, the climate movement, like, that's a little bit on its heels, they were never robustly for any of those climate solutions, right? There's like a little small modular nuclear contingent that got some traction at the end of the Biden administration. But you're going to be hard pressed to find more than the wonkiest think tanks coming out with the full-throated support of carbon capture sequestration, direct air capture, hydrogen. Why? Because these things require drilling and pipelines and more infrastructure and building things. And let's even take this a step further. Geothermal has enjoyed this like kind of weird support. Like, maybe we would support clean geothermal. Okay, would you support geothermal with fracking? Because that's what you're going to have to support. So right now, it's really interesting. There's no full-throated left coalition that's for all those things. Even in the abundance book, they really talk about renewables and maybe nuclear, right? Like, but we're going to need these very pragmatic, scalable solutions. And if the left isn't advocating for them and the center left isn't really committed to advocating for them, does that leave that the responsibility of the center right? Maybe. But in this political environment where you almost can't say climate, that's a very dangerous thing to do on the right. So I think there's a real opportunity and a real need for a center-left, center-right, full-throated support of decarbonization solutions that don't neatly fit into the myth of an easy energy transition. And this is pretty interesting and cool, right? Because really smart people who understand the trade-offs of reducing global emissions understand that we're going to need CCS. We're going to need low and no carbon gases. We're going to need to build a bunch of transmission lines. And I haven't even gotten into what happens with all the power we're going to need, right? I'm just speaking in of the simplest philosophical needs. So I think however abundance evolves or whatever comes after abundance needs to have a very deeply pragmatic center-left agenda, right? And then the center right will have someone to partner with. And oil and gas companies who are energy companies who have all the skills needed will have someone to partner with. And for that to happen, here's the thing I'm trying to get my mind around. That only happens if you oil and gas company, you oil and gas leader, is not mothballing all your projects because they're not popular right now, right? This only happens if you're looking 5 years ahead and saying, okay, in a world where climate or decarbonization or emissions reductions is a priority, we have always been here working on these projects. If you're not doing that, like, who is going to do that? Like, what center lefty think tank is going to be going, hey, we should do CCS if there's no one out there actually trying to build CCS? Now, one of the things I love about thinking about this and our agency in driving whatever comes next out of this political polarized moment, what I love about it is no matter what, one, you got to build a bunch of stuff. And two, you're going to need pipelines. And pipelines have gotten to be this weirdly forbidden thing that we need to make cool again. Like transmission lines are somehow becoming cool, but pipelines aren't. This is a window for us to shape that future conversation. So I really want to think about that. Okay. And then the bridge one farther, of course, that I want to go is I think that an abundance movement or whatever comes next has to be unapologetically pro natural gas. First, just as a good alternative in a world where a lot of people are building coal, even proposing building coal in America. And so even unabated, right? Pro natural gas, it's better than the alternatives, but also the potential to abate it as a point source and use that CO2 either as a product or for sequestration. So abated natural gas, I think this is really important. And then if I want to just go super crazy in my vision of what comes after abundance, I mean, I think it should be realistic about oil. It's so funny in climate circles that you'd be like, well, maybe natural gas, maybe for a limited amount of time. But let's just talk about the very not available, scalable solutions to replace the tremendous amount of oil the world is using right now and its products. And like when the myth of an easy energy transition is finally put to bed forever, I guess that was kind of a morbid metaphor, but yes, I want it like 6 feet under. If it requires a stake, I think that's fine. But when that happens, that means we can actually work on energy, climate, emissions reductions, decarbonization in a coherent way. Right now, we have these like pretend conversations. So this wasn't what I meant to do with my abundance primer, but you know, maybe that was that second cup of coffee. But what I am increasingly coming to think is if you don't love the myth of an easy energy transition, then the most important thing that you need to do is participate in emissions reductions and climate conversations and energy conversations, not imagine they will never return, but have the conversation that you wish was replacing the myth. And provide the projects that you imagine will actually create the energy future in a world that cares about emissions reduction. Because here's the thing, what's the alternative? I'm just going to walk through this again. And if I'm getting repetitive, forgive me, but this is my brain trying to get out of the swirl and into something coherent. Is okay. Let's just say right now, you're living and operating in a world where no one wants to say climate, CCS, decarbonization. Understood. And in 4 or 8 years, there will be an election. And if we didn't actually take on and replace the myth of an easy energy transition, I think the likeliest outcome is that whatever democratic force emerges, that the most likely scenario is they will say, oh my gosh, climate is even more urgent 4 years later. And those horrible, horrible people who were in power and those horrible, horrible oil and gas companies that got to build a whole bunch of stuff while they were in power, they made it all worse. And now we need to take them out now more than ever. I don't think the inevitable result of today is that we get a pragmatic energy and climate conversation. I think the default position is that we swing from one polarized extreme to another polarized extreme. So if you, like me, are exhausted by polarized extremes and want to participate in a different outcome, then you have to plant the seeds for the outcome now. So what would that look like? I think, one, it means like pay attention to this abundance movement. Pay attention to this battle for the heart and mind of the Democrats right now. Is it going to go more resistance, more progressive, more orthodoxy? Is it going to go that way? Or is it going to go, hey, we got to moderate, move to the middle, talk about trade-offs? I think that's something we should pay attention to. One. Two, I think we should actively try to shape what comes after abundance. What comes after that? And what's a truly central, truly bipartisan next thing? It's about innovation. It's about supply. It's about building. It's about a better, more prosperous future, right? It's what we all always thought the future was going to bring. And it's paired with a smaller environmental footprint, right? And that can and should include a lower emissions footprint writ large and a lower greenhouse gas footprint, because it would just be sort of silly to not acknowledge that we could be reducing greenhouse gas emissions in our work, especially since we're like a pretty big part of those emissions. So I think if your organization does not currently have relationships with reasonable NGOs, with think tanks, with groups that do convenings, one, you should reach out to me so we can help you get those relationships. But two, now is the time to build those, right? Now is the time. You're perceived as the winner. You're perceived as having anything you want. Now is the time to reach out and nurture those relationships. But I would go even a step further, which is to say that you should be actively encouraging collaborations to shape energy and climate conversations that are novel and that put decarbonization at the center. They're just not going to be credible. I think we can all acknowledge there's going to be a huge power build out in the US and globally. And I think we can all agree that there's going to be a whole bunch of unabated natural gas and maybe even a whole bunch of pipelines built. So let's just acknowledge that. But let's not imagine that that's the end of this story. That could be the end of the story of how you were the villain, if that is not all paired with some really thoughtful reducing of emissions, reducing of footprints, improving innovation plans. That's what's going to make it credible when the winds shift again. I'm pretty excited about this, actually. That's where I landed at the end of this philosophizing, because this is more than just like, hey, there's the moment, don't blow it. This is like, hey, there's a moment, shape it, participate in it, have agency in not only the future of your company, but have agency in the future of depolarized politics. Yeah, that's what I talked myself into. So I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about that. That's our episode for today. And you have been listening to a solo pod with me, Tisha Schuller, on Energy Thinks. I'd like to thank you, our listeners, for your ideas. As you can tell, they're really shaping my book, The Myth and the Moment. And I'm still working out just the final little tidbits of that. But my hope is pretty soon you're going to get some opportunities to pre-order that. And I'll be looking to have that out into summer, early fall. And I hope that you'll also stay engaged with this idea of the center left, climate pragmatism, practical environmentalism, whatever you want to call it, abundance. Be paying attention, understand what's happening, think about if that is our partners, how do we engage with that? Or is there something that comes after that? And what is that? And how do we shape that? And how do we inform that? I'm really interested in that thinking. So I hope if you like what you're hearing, that you will take a moment and give Energy Thinks 5 stars wherever you listen to your podcast. It helps others find us. If you would like to know more about our work, please check out energythinks.com. And while you're there, I hope you will subscribe to my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. I'll be putting out all the updates about the book there. I would like to thank my colleague Kayla Chieves for making Energy Thinks possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.